Greetings, salutations, and a very warm welcome back to Polar Warriors. I published a poll on Patreon asking people to vote on what they think the next video topic should be. You can find a link at the top of all my videos if you're interested in becoming a patron. This will give you exclusive access to a lot of videos that aren't on YouTube, a look into my personal life and struggles, and a direct line of communication to me where I will always respond to you. Anyways, there was an overwhelming support for talking about bipolar rage, agitation, or anxiety that's commonly associated with bipolar mania. This is another one of those topics that people just don't talk about. It's right up there with the video topic I did about hypersexuality. Of course, people don't want to talk publicly about how they conduct themselves while experiencing rage or hypersexuality. Those are the kind of, quote, embarrassing things that go on behind closed doors, and everyone's afraid to talk about it. That's why a video about this is really important to get out there to people on my channel. I experience extremely uncomfortable agitation quite often when I get overstimulated or manic instead of the euphoria that some people associate with hypomania. In fact, I've probably done some of the worst self-sabotage to my jobs, relationships, and friends when this happens. It's one of the very dark sides of bipolar disorder. There's a few names for symptoms like this. Some people call it dysphoric mania, which is basically the opposite of euphoric mania. Some people call them mixed states, aggravated mania, or my personal favorite, absolute hell. Anyways, for most of us, the feelings of agitation or even rage tend to go unnoticed until they just get completely out of control. The feelings are so incredibly real and so intense, it really tests our ability to maintain our composure, and everyone has a different threshold. It's a horrible feeling, to say the least, and I'm sure many of you know very well what I'm talking about. Here's something really important to remember. Part of the illness is not being able to tell that we're symptomatic. That doesn't mean the others around us don't notice it, that's for darn sure, but often we just can't. All we know is that we're suffering greatly and we don't know why. Having a reason for our suffering always makes it easier, and this is where anger or rage and even depression gets misdirected towards others, and it causes a lot of unnecessary harm. If our toe started hurting for absolutely no reason, it would be really confusing and hard to accept. If we knew that we dropped a rock on our toe, it would make it easier to understand what happened and basically move past it. When we're hurting inside and don't have a reason, we usually find one. Unfortunately, a lot of the time, we just pick something. It could be something our partner did, somebody that cut us off while we were driving, the house being a little bit dirty, kids being too loud, basically anything that we can grasp onto. Most of these things wouldn't even normally bother us, but when we're on a quest to find a reason for the suffering, it's easy to get confused or misdirected as far as where it's coming from. That's why self-awareness is so crucial. The more we become aware of how we're feeling, the easier it'll be to intercept symptoms before they get out of control. This is not easy, and it takes a lot of practice, patience, and determination to cultivate that kind of self-awareness. I'm still working on that myself. What I practice is basically just being okay with not having a specific reason for my suffering. I'll tell myself things like, this is just the depression, or this is agitation, it's a part of my illness, there's nothing wrong with my life right now, and that these feelings never last forever. Now, that doesn't make it all go away, but at least my reason becomes my bipolar instead of my partner, friends, or my boss. Bipolar rage usually starts out with mild irritation or a trigger that compounds, and then the anger clock starts counting down like the timer on a bomb. We can go from mild to wild or happy to snappy so quickly. Sometimes it can be the simplest trigger, something that basically wouldn't irritate the average individual so much per se, but it causes us to overreact with extreme anger or rage. It's probably one of the very top reasons why our relationships with others don't last and we end up emotionally isolated. A lot of us, myself included, are very peaceful, happy people by nature. So it can be so surprising and confusing when other people see us lose our shit, so to speak. Many of our loved ones go from walking on eggshells to being like a deer stuck in the headlights when we explode. And there's only so many times that we can keep saying I'm sorry until it just doesn't mean anything anymore. Bipolar disorder in general often goes untreated because we usually don't go to the doctor when we're agitated or euphoric, much less telling a doctor that we started punching holes in the wall or that we were abusive to someone. Irritability can be just as draining as depression, and unfortunately, we usually have more energy to do bad things when we're manic compared to depression. Manic rage is extremely serious and it needs to be taken seriously. The consequences of our anger can be huge, but the symptom tends to receive less attention than the depression or even euphoric mania. Experiencing irritable moods are actually among the primary diagnostic criteria for mania and hypomania. It's also being studied as a hallmark for depression as well. Most people take for granted how much anger can affect our overall health. There's a video I made that talks about a scary fact associated with bipolar disorder in regards to a hormone called cortisol that gets released during a fight or flight response. Elevated levels of cortisol can reduce our lifespan, compromise our immune system, and wreak havoc with our health. Please check out that video if you haven't seen it yet, because it's an important one. Well-trained bipolar specialists are usually cautious in distinguishing the difference between occasional outbursts of anger versus the long, simmering agitation of mania that builds up over time. This can be a tough one, especially for those of us who rapid cycle, because we can go from feeling euphoric to irritable and then depressed in a very short period of time. A guy named David Dunner, who's the director at the Center for Anxiety and Depression in Washington, said that instantaneous anger that lasts a few minutes and occurs twice a week is not bipolar. It's being angry. Irritability can be present during both the highs and the lows, but irritability without mania makes him suspect that the illness might not be bipolar related. Anger is just part of being a human being. Throwing a temper tantrum every once in a while doesn't mean that someone has bipolar disorder. People can get angry in response to physical symptoms, life circumstances, substance abuse, and a lot more. There is also people who experience intermittent explosive anger or other mood disorders that are just associated with angry outbursts. That's why it's really important to consult a specialist if possible and not just a general practitioner. Bipolar disorder has also been misconstrued in the media quite a bit lately, and it's been really easy for the public in general to blame abnormal behavior on it or mental health in general, even though it might not be bipolar disorder at all. Bipolar disorder might not be the exclusive cause of anger, but if we do have a bipolar diagnosis, it can play a big factor in how our treatment is approached. It's also common for actual bipolar patients to blame their destructive, violent behavior on the bipolar disorder when the bipolar disorder can't be held exclusively accountable. It's only a factor of the equation, and we shouldn't use our disorder as an excuse for hurtful behavior. There's a lot of debate and studies going on to determine if agitation during depression or mania puts people at a higher risk for even developing bipolar disorder. Researchers at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston found that 40% of patients with bipolar had significant levels of irritability within a 1-week period. Another study published in the Journal of Affective Disorders stated that at least a third of bipolar patients described frequent bouts of agitation or anger attacks. Another study in 2012 involving over 500 people found that those with bipolar, regardless of the type, are more likely to be argumentative, feel hostile towards others, have hot tempers, and act with explosive outbursts, especially during an episode. So many doctors who are inexperienced will chalk it up to things like teenage hormones or tell someone's partner or parent that all your spouse or kid needs is to attend some anger management classes or basic therapy. Come to find out decades later that they actually had bipolar disorder. I was running chains of karate schools when I had a total meltdown, and I'm extremely grateful that I didn't end up killing someone else, or worse yet, myself. That's why getting an accurate diagnosis is so crucial. Keep in mind that if you have a history of substance abuse like alcohol, pills, opiates especially, and other drugs, you're basically adding rocket fuel to your symptoms. Even excessive caffeine, like energy drinks, can contribute to our irritability. Sometimes just quitting substances can be equally as effective as medications in reducing agitation. A lot of people also abuse prescriptions like Xanax, Valium, and other drugs which just mask the problem, and they're extremely addictive if they aren't being used in an emergency situation. Another important thing to know is if you take just an antidepressant alone, it can make the mania a lot worse. So that's why combinations of medications like mood stabilizers are crucial for balancing out both ends of the spectrum. This is a spectrum disorder, not a single or a unipolar disorder. It's also really common for people with bipolar disorder to be diagnosed with things like ADHD, OCD, or other diagnoses that can feed the rage and obsessive thinking. It's important to take these things into account. So now let's talk strategies. There are so many different coping skills, and what works for one person might not work for everyone. Please keep an open mind and remember that I'm not a doctor, I'm just a bipolar coach, and I'm donating my time to help people. So if I don't have an immediate solution for your struggles, at least I'm doing my part to try and help others. So hopefully you can see that. First off, self-awareness and self-dialogue are extremely important. Like I touched on earlier, one of the best coping skills that I've found is to first realize that I'm feeling uncomfortable, and then to stop and ask myself, if I was in a great mood, would this still upset me? We have to be really careful with our response back to ourselves because it's so easy to let the anger cloud our judgment. Our minds can do these mental gymnastics to convince ourselves that we have a reason to be pissed off. I've found that the answer is usually no, this normally wouldn't bother me if I was in a more stable place. I'm sure there's many times where you've walked through the house, for example, and it was messy and it didn't bother you at all. And then there's other times where it was the end of the world, or times where you go to a social gathering and you felt like you're the life of the party. And other times you just felt really agitated and wanted to get the heck out of there as soon as possible. That just goes to show that it doesn't have so much to do with our external environment, but more with what's going on inside of us. Now, that's not to say that our environment can't cause a lot of irritation or agitation, but putting it into perspective, a lot of the times that's not the core issue. It takes a lot of work to cultivate awareness where you can catch things like this and look at a situation with clarity. I'm still working on this myself to this very day. Another important question that you can learn to ask yourself would be things like, is this really how I want to handle this situation right now? Or another good one would be, is this a good time to have a conversation like this? Or do I need to excuse myself from the situation immediately before I lose control? Sometimes assessing the situation like this, even for just a brief moment, can buy us a few extra seconds to decide what our next best move is. It's also working towards cultivating that precious self-awareness that I keep talking about. So the next thing would be learning to not chase the mania, as I call it, or to keep doing something that, even though we know it's getting us more upset by the minute, we just can't stop. If you're watching the news and it starts to make you really angry, do you have the willpower to turn it off? The same goes for playing a video game when it starts getting frustrating, or pushing ourselves to finish a project when it's obviously becoming an unhealthy obsession, or having an uncomfortable conversation or a debate with someone when we know that it's not going to be beneficial to us at that moment. The next time you get agitated over something going on in your environment, test yourself to see if you can find the discipline to set it aside and walk away. This is a really hard one for me because I get this OCD tunnel vision and I can be quite stubborn. I can't tell you how many times my partner said, I really think you should stop. And even though I knew it was the right thing to do, for some reason, I just couldn't let it go. Sometimes I would get unfairly upset with my partner or even feel mild resentment, even though their observation was spot on. I just couldn't see through my emotions at the time, and that's normal. For some reason, I felt like if I can just make it past this level, or if I can just finish this project, then I'll feel better. And the crazy part is, I usually don't feel much better at all. I just feel exhausted when I'm finally done with only a mediocre sense of satisfaction. It's so easy to keep feeding the mania until it turns into agitation and then progresses to rage. It takes a lot of practice to become aware and to stop before the bomb goes off. Sometimes I'll even visualize a giant red stop sign in my head, because we see those all the time when we're out driving, and then just stop. I'm still working on this, but at least I'm diligently doing something about it, and I'm slowly getting better at it. Another extremely important one is not getting anywhere near the keyboard when we're agitated. Whatever we post online stays there forever. We can't take back a nasty text message or an email, and most of the time it always ends up being something that we hugely regret once we're stable again. I mean, how many times have you sent a message to someone when you were upset, only to read it back later and feel so embarrassed or ashamed? Is it really worth having to go through the whole "I'm so sorry, I wasn't feeling well" thing again and again and again? Like I said, we can only say "I'm sorry" so many times before people don't even want to hear it. I've unfortunately had to block a couple of people from my Polar Warrior Facebook page for sending random, unsubstantiated, nasty messages to someone like me who's always been there for them. I've always tried my best to understand that people who are hurting tend to hurt other people, but we all have our limits. I mean, could you imagine losing my support completely because of one regretful message? Well, how about an entire marriage or a job? I've been there myself. Moving on, manic rage creates an unbelievable amount of pent-up energy. Without some kind of outlet, it usually comes out one way or another. It's kind of like calories. If you don't burn them off in a healthy way, they just end up getting stored in the body in an unhealthy way until it starts affecting our well-being. Exercise is probably one of the best things that you could possibly do, not only for minimizing anxiety, but for all bipolar symptoms. Physical exercise can stimulate our feel-good endorphins. Studies have proven that when you exercise, your brain releases a protein called BDNF, which can minimize bipolar symptoms as well as provide a wealth of other health benefits. I'd strongly suggest a physical outlet that keeps your mind just as busy as your body. Sometimes just mindlessly walking on the treadmill doesn't stop us from dwelling on the things that upset us. Try something like martial arts or a group cycling class, aerobic classes, water aerobics, basically anything where you're exercising and having to interact with other people. Even if you aren't in a place to socialize, you'll still have to pay attention to the class, which keeps your mind in the present moment. Mindful exercise is a lot healthier than mindless exercise, especially for us. Also, if you're new to an exercise program, it can be so easy to overdo it, especially when you're manic. I remember one time I exercised so hard when I was upset that my legs just gave out when I was walking down some stairs. I didn't go back to the gym for a month, so it's much healthier to do a 5-minute walk every day starting out instead of a 10-mile hike once a month. You'll accomplish a lot more in the long run that way, so definitely keep that in mind. Now, moving on to the next coping skill, a lot of people equate anger attacks to the way panic attacks happen. Sometimes they'll experience a rush of adrenaline and endorphins, causing our fight or flight responses to just go berserk. Most people have some kind of coping mechanisms for panic attacks, like deep breathing, changing your environment, medication, meditation, or whatever works. Why don't we have coping skills ready for anger attacks? Like I said, agitation doesn't get the same attention as other symptoms do. What works for each person is different, so it's really important to encourage to approach manic rage in the same way we do our other symptoms. We need to figure out what works and what doesn't when we get angry and take action immediately. If your child, your pet, your partner, or even your work environment starts to become a trigger, it's beyond important to utilize some of the coping strategies before we cause irreparable damage. All it takes is beating a dog once and it will cower from people for the rest of its life. The same goes with our child or our spouse. It makes me sick when I go to pet a dog and it cowers, like I'm gonna hit it or something. They never forget something like that, ever. The same thing goes for people. If you're at work, go sit in the bathroom stall and listen to something you enjoy, or breathe deeply until you can come back to the situation with a calmer resolve. If you're about to lose it in front of your family or someone that you care about, that's when you need to drop what you're doing and remove yourself from the situation. Most of us know that we have to do this. It just comes down to how serious we take our symptoms and how dedicated we are to getting better. Every single time that you're able to practice coping skills like walking away, it creates a sense of self-confidence and resolve to where it gets easier and easier to walk away the next time. These are the difficult things that make us polar warriors. So the next thing that I want to talk about is crucially important. I've talked a lot about triggers, and it's really important to start paying attention to specific things that trigger our rage. It could be a specific person or personality type, certain sounds, certain places, or even certain things that we put in our bodies. Now, agitation usually compounds, or it gets progressively worse. It's so important to watch for what's called the master trigger. I did a whole video talking about this. It might start out with a stressful day at work, which made the drive home in traffic intolerable, which caused an argument with your spouse when you got home, which caused you to lose sleep, which then caused you to increase drinking coffee or your caffeine consumption. It just goes on and on and on until there's a breaking point, all of which just started with a stressful day at work. And if we can trace our steps back, we can start discovering that master trigger. If you learn to take action at the first sign of an identified trigger, it can make a huge difference in stopping subsequent triggers that lead up to bipolar rage. If you do end up losing control, sometimes it's followed by huge feelings of regret, remorse, or self-loathing, which can lead to depression. If you're feeling exhausted after a fit of rage, it's important to also prepare for coping strategies if the depression starts coming on. All of this is so incredibly connected. All right, so moving on, I guess it goes without saying, but this next one would be asking your doctor to either adjust your medication or provide you with some kind of anti-anxiety medication for use in an emergency situation. Just be extremely careful because, like I said, anxiety medication can be so highly addictive. I am all about natural remedies if possible. I rarely talk about my medications because what works for one person can be catastrophic for another. I do, however, take an herbal supplement called kava kava, and it has an amazing calming effect. If you haven't heard of it, consider checking out kava at your local health food store, but always check with your doctor first before taking anything. A lot of recent studies have also shown natural remedies like CBD that can be really helpful. I'll dedicate an entire video to talking about medicinal cannabis in the future, and there's a huge debate in the bipolar community as far as its effectiveness. Some people absolutely swear against it, while others have prevented themselves from going to the emergency room by using it. I'm not going to take a stance either way right now, and this will be a great topic for another day. Another form of treatment, which goes without saying, of course, is therapy. And there's many different kinds of therapy, though, and some of them can be more effective than others when it comes to treating bipolar disorder. CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, is my personal favorite, and it's a brilliant approach to exploring our minds. I couldn't recommend it enough for anyone who has bipolar disorder, so if you haven't heard of CBT, please check it out. It's one of the most widely used evidence-based practices for improving mental health modernly. It focuses on the development of coping strategies specifically and changing unhelpful thoughts, attitudes, and behaviors. It was originally designed to treat depression, but now it's used for a variety of mental health conditions. This will be another great topic for a future video because there's a lot that can be said about this type of therapy and how it correlates to treating bipolar disorder. There's also nothing wrong with taking anger management classes, and a lot of communities offer them for free, which is great. There's also many videos, books, articles, and resources online for people interested in taking the self-help approach, but nothing really beats that interaction with a licensed professional. It also comes down to how much effort you're willing to put into treating your symptoms. Another helpful tip is to keep some kind of journal so that you can document the patterns of your mood changes. There's even phone apps that are great for this. You might think that you have a horrible week, but then when you look back and see that it was just a single day and the rest of the week wasn't as bad as you thought, that can help. It also can show you that there's an unacceptable amount of instability still and that medications or treatment approaches might need to be changed. Even if you don't write in it every day, mood journals can be invaluable to you, your doctor, your therapist, and partner. Coping skills are basically anything that interrupts the anger response process. It can be even the simplest things like deep breaths and counting to 10, spending time with your loving dog or cat, getting some space, playing some feel-good music, changing the scenery by going on a walk, things like that. Now, once things get past a certain threshold, these strategies might not be strong enough to penetrate to the severity of the emotions. That's why it's so important to try to do something about it at the very first signs of irritability before we lose control. A lot of people will develop unhealthy coping skills like punching a wall or breaking something or wanting others around them to suffer just as much as they do to, quote, level the playing field. I've done a lot of these things, and I can tell you the pain in my hand from punching a wall might distract me from agitation for a minute, or breaking something might make me focus on the present moment temporarily, but I always end up in a worse place than where I started. The last thing that I want to mention is how unbelievably valuable the observation and feedback from others can be. Those around us can usually always notice symptoms before we do. I've gone to great lengths to educate my partner and family about my disorder, and more importantly, I'm very open and inviting to their feedback if they observe my behavior shifting. They're usually always right. I've turned the people around me basically into allies to help me with my coping skills. Here's what's really important though. All it takes is once to punish someone for their feedback, and they're not going to be as motivated to help us anymore. If you ask for people's help, you need to be okay receiving it, even if it isn't what you want to hear or it might not fix everything in the moment. You can always say, I'm not in a place right now where this is going to help me, but I appreciate you trying, and then remove yourself from the situation. It's really important for our supporters to know when they can't reach us and when they need to remove themselves from the room. Even if it just upsets us more or they feel some kind of mild guilt from walking away. It'll always be better in the long run than having a knockdown, drag-out fight. Our observers need to be very well trained in how we experience our bipolar disorder. It manifests differently for everyone. It can also be hard enough for adults to notice the symptoms, much less younger members of the family. It can also be helpful to have an age-appropriate discussion with your kids about the bipolar diagnosis. You can simply acknowledge that you have a medical condition, and instead of having problems like a headache or a fever, the symptoms cause you to feel excited, angry, or very tired. Try to put it into a simple or relatable context where other people can understand. It's also very important that they know it's not their fault, and I can't stress that enough. So the bottom line is, through all of this, is that no one can make us feel worse than ourselves. We need to slowly learn to take responsibility or accountability for our anger, cultivate self-awareness where we can notice when symptoms first arise, figure out which coping skills work for each of us as an individual, and learn to forgive ourselves for things that we might have said or done to people that we care about. Also try to make amends whenever possible, and continually remember that we're in charge, not the bipolar disorder.